All right, guys. Welcome to another edition of the Killing Fields. It is February the 10th, 2023, and we have a very special guest here, author, independent researcher, and world renowned expert on the JQ and other such controversial issues. And thank you for coming on the Killing Fields, Mr. Bjerknes.
Thank you so very much for having me on. It's a pleasure.
Okay, so let's get into some of the questioning. Go ahead, Marshall, if you could lead us off.
Yeah, thank you for coming on, Christopher. So you were kind enough to send me a copy of your book. I enjoyed it. I would say it's the best book about the Armenian Genocide to date. And I was a big fan of your other book, which you published in 2006.
Thank you very much.
I think you did an excellent job of relating the history to like the religious context, and it's like it's a history book, but there's like a story element to it, like it's related to Jewish mythology, and I labor this point again and again and again that the Bible is the best-selling book ever, but as you've pointed out, it's an open plan to exterminate non-Jews, and people need to understand the significance of that. So I have some notes here, some greatest hits, so to speak, quotes from the book that we could go through and introduce people to this critical topic. So long story short, so we're talking about the forbidden history of the Armenian Holocaust, which you updated from your 2006 book and added some more information. So long story short, basically, the genocide of the Armenians, and by extension the Assyrians and the Greeks, was orchestrated by Jews who pretended to be Muslims. So they called themselves Young Turks, and this was known at the time. We have military sources, everyday newspapers, mainstream sources, Jewish sources, which reveal this. So, for example, the three Pashas and like Ataturk were actually Jews, crypto Jews, and you made some YouTube videos recently, like little biographies about those odious people, and they had financial support. For example, Alexander Parvus, who also funded the so-called Russian Revolution. And there's a good chapter on Jewish bankers bankrupted the Turkish Empire, like Camendo, Alatini, Modiano, and Maitre Salem. And there's also the links with Freemasonry and Salonika, which are significant. And by the way, just feel free to interject anything.
That's all 100% correct. Thank you very much. You're the best prepared interviewer I've experienced so far.
Thanks.
It is tremendously significant that these so-called Young Turks were in fact Jews, and they were the most pernicious of Jews. They were crypto-Jewish Dernmei, who were followers of the false messiah of the Jews, Shabbatai Tzevi. And they were Zionist Jews, and they believed that the time had come for the Jewish people to be restored to Palestine, and this entailed the complete extermination of the Amalekites.
Yeah.
And that is made clear in that book, that bestseller, that in Deuteronomy chapter 25, verses 17 to 19, and Exodus chapter 17, verses 14 to 16, it expressly states that the Amalekites have to be completely exterminated. And the Talmud in Sanhedrin, folio 20b, amplifies that and targets it to the restoration of the Jews to Palestine. Before they can be restored and build their temple and anoint their king, they had to exterminate the Amalekites, and they just so happened to call the Armenians the Amalekites.
It's one of the 613 mitzvot to exterminate the Amalekites.
Absolutely. It's three of them, actually. Three of them relate directly to the extermination of the Amalekites.
Yeah,
on page meaning commandment.
Yeah. And page 178, you point out that the Talmud specified that when the Jews took Palestine, they would have to exterminate the Amalekites. And something striking is that the commandments, I think, issued by Talat Pasha to exterminate the Armenians resemble the 10 Commandments.
Yes, and they are expressed in the exact words of Deuteronomy 25:19 and Exodus 17:14 to 16, where it says that the Amalekites have to be blotted out. And they expressly stated in their orders that the Armenians have to be blotted out and their name forgotten, which is the express terminology of the extermination of the Amalekites. And that is not coincidental.
The Armenians were identified as the Amalekites. And for example, the book Reckless Rights, Purim and the Legacy of Jewish Violence, Elliot Horowitz discussed this.
Absolutely, yes. And he pointed out the fact that Armenians continue to be persecuted in Israel, in Jerusalem especially. And very recently, Armenians were violently attacked in Jerusalem at one of their restaurants, and chairs were thrown at them. And Elliot Horowitz had pointed out other incidences of violence by extreme Orthodox Jews against Armenians.
Yeah. And here's another pertinent quote from page 14 of your book. Bonar and McShane, researchers, suggested that the peculiar hatred which the Jews bear to the Armenians may arise from a charge often brought against them, namely that Haman was an Armenian and that the Armenians are the Amalekites of the Bible.
Yes, and this goes back for more than 1,000 years, at least, in the Josephon Chronicles, which are attributed to Flavius Josephus, the famous Jewish historian. It states that the Armenians are the Amalekites, and quite significantly, the Oriental Jews, which includes the Dermei, referred to them not only as Amalekites, but as Timhei, which is the Hebrew word used in Deuteronomy, meaning thou shalt blot out. So whenever they made references to Armenians, they referred to them as thou shalt blot out. And it is certainly not coincidental that they issued orders to blot them out in those same express terms.
Yes. And here's another quote from page 84 of your book. The religious belief that Armenians are the seed of Satan and that the God of Israel commands the Jews to exterminate them, coupled together with the fact that the Young Turk leaders who ordered the complete genocide of the Armenians were Jewish, serves as irrefutable proof that their attack was a religiously and racially motivated Jewish extermination campaign of a Gentile people. Their dangerous xenophobic beliefs have never been denounced or repudiated by mainstream Judaic religious authorities, and were openly advocated by Rebbe Menachem Mendel Schneerson and the chief Sephardic rabbi of Israel, Ovadia Yosef, in the late 20th and early 21st centuries. Most modern Jews reject religion altogether and certainly do not endorse the extremism of Judaism. But nevertheless, these genocides continue to occur, and the Palestinians are being driven out of their homeland by secular and religious Jews alike. Some Jews now refer to Palestinians as Amalekites.
And that was another one of the things that Elliot Horowitz pointed out in his book, Reckless Rights, is that the Palestinians are now referred to as Amalekites and are likewise being exterminated.
Yes.
And I think it's significant that Jews say, well, all these things were written in ancient times, and they were under persecution from the Romans, and the Talmud is a response to that persecution. But they never say that the beliefs are false or that they repudiate them. They try to excuse them as being the product of persecution against Jews. But those beliefs much predate the Talmud and predate even the Septuagint. And they simply continue to believe them, and they try to justify them. And they make it appear to Gentiles as if they no longer believe in this, but the rabbis never repudiate a word of it.
Right. Dovetailing from the point about Armenians as Amalekites, which is essentially like racist. And
it's the worst form of racism. It's exterminatory, genocidal racism.
And it's corroborated all throughout Judaism, Torah, the Talmud, Kabbalah. But
and the
here's
Midrash.
this is something you discuss in your book that I found like absolutely obscene and racist, is that according to Kabbalistic sources, basically when non-Jews die, they go to Gehinnom, hell, and they're buried in a pile of excrement, which is located in Akeldama, the field of blood, the graveyard of non-Jews. And this graveyard was purchased by Jewish priests with money from Judas, symbolically representing Jews collectively. And Armenians guard the gates of Gehinnom and own this like pile of excrement graveyard of non-Jews.
Isn't that
correct?
amazing?
Yeah.
That's correct. Since 1402, at least, it is known that Armenians own the field of blood, Akeldama. And it was purchased to become a graveyard for Gentiles. And then Jews set about to exterminate the Armenians who guard this graveyard. None of that is coincidental. And people have to understand how this is perceived by the Kabbalists who set about to exterminate the Armenians. All of this very clearly represented to them justification for their belief that the Armenians are these Amalekites.
So,
and that area, Gehinnom, please forgive me for interrupting, but I think it's very important for people to understand this. That Gehinnom, the valley of Gehinnom, is hell. And it was the place where the ancient Jews used to sacrifice their firstborn children to Moloch. The Armenians are represented as the Amalekites who represent the firstborn, much as the Egyptians did, of primordial chaos. Mm-hmm. And therefore, they are dirt representing the material world as opposed to the holy world. And therefore, they have to return to that hell of Gehinnom. And there are passages within the Zohar that talk about the idea that Jesus rots in this dung heap of Gehinnom to nourish the tree of the knowledge of good and evil until its fruit become ripe, and that all Christians are to be mass murdered and thrown into this dung heap to be consumed by the worms and be what the Kabbalists refer to as nullified, so that they return to primordial chaos as dissolved matter. Satan is the great divider, and he breaks apart the unity of the Holy One into infinitely particulate differentiations of chaos. And that is the process of Gehinnom, and damning Gentiles to hell is to lower them on the great chain of being from having souls to simply being dung, and from there becoming nothingness. It is the nullification of the Gentiles. And I have all of the documentation to prove this.
Well, I was going to ask you, I was going to interject here, if you don't mind, Mr. Bjerknes, or
please do.
How much of like the metaphysics of, as opposed to like the Jews and their enemies per se, and they were the ancient Hebrews in that time period, how much of that can be attributed maybe to influence from Egyptians? Because Egyptians, as you mentioned, have a very similar concept. I think they call their enemies Icefrit, and there's another term that they refer to them, but they see them as primordial chaos, as you mentioned. So how much of this inheritance was from the ancient Egyptians themselves that was absorbed by the later Hebrews and maybe in the rabbinical hierarchy in later times? I'm just curious about that. It's kind of a left field question, but I've always wondered about that.
It's a great question. It's a wonderful question. I look forward to answering it. Both directly and indirectly, it is almost 100% derived from the Egyptians and the Sumerians. But it took a circuitous route to get to the Jews. It was not necessarily directly given to them by the Egyptians. It was filtered and explained to them through the lens of the Greeks and the Platonists. And the Platonists, in turn, absorbed a lot from the Zoroastrians and the Mithraic mythologies of Mithras, and the ascent up 7 planets to the heavens beyond the heavens in a restoration, a mystical unification with the gods that has to be done through a mystical journey across the 7 planets. And that's how the number 7 became very significant. So there are a multiplicity of influences, but in terms of chaos and the theory of the serpent Apep and Ra as the sun and day and night representing polar opposites, and the 2 aspects of reality coming from the gods as a duality that has to be balanced and recombined, just as the sexes have to be recombined into an androgynous form.
Yep.
All of that is extremely Egyptian.
So, how many Jews believe in this racist, like, Kabbalah stuff? Do you
There's
think?
no way of knowing, but I think what's more significant is the impact that this racist Kabbalic thought has
Yeah.
had upon Jews in general, culturally, as
Yeah.
their heritage, as their history, and as a will to generate animosity against Gentiles, and to ensure that Gentiles have animosity towards Jews, to keep Jews racially segregated, persecuted, and provide them with atonement. So
Jews
whether they
feared their
believe
God.
it or not, the Jewish community in general throughout history has had this mindset that is derived from these beliefs. The vast majority of them have no understanding of this, would not know what I'm talking about. Any Kabbalist who has been taught the oral tradition of Kabbalah, which has never been written down, would immediately pick up on everything that I'm saying and would know that it's 100% correct, which is why
Right.
nobody tries to refute what I'm saying, because they know I have sources to support it and I can intelligently argue the facts.
Right.
So the Jews have also been, the Jewish masses have also been victims of this. And the victimization of Jewish people takes place in the same way that the victimization of the Armenians took place. And that is the Yom Kippur ritual of sacrificing 2 goats as expiation goats. One of the goats is sacrificed in the temple and its blood spilled upon the horns of the altar. That represents the twin Jacob, who is Jewry. So Jews must also be sacrificed so that the holy side receives its due of sacrifices. And the Gentiles represent the scapegoat, which is sent into the wilderness and given to the devil, Samael, Azazel, Hasatan.
Yeah. And
so it's all part and parcel of the same process, and the entire world is being victimized by it. But the Jewish people reflexively defend it, because part of this cultural heritage is the idea that they have to defend one another and always attack Gentiles and portray Gentiles as if inherently evil and Jews as if inherently moral and good. And that has penetrated the psyche of far too many Jews, though certainly not all Jews.
Concerning the scapegoat idea, you made a good point on page 191. The fact that Armenians believe that it was Bartholomew, Satan, who converted their ancestors to Christianity, means to the Kabbalists that the devil found his offspring in the Armenians and would accept them as scapegoats like Christ, their God. So this is the idea that Christianity was a deception crafted for Gentiles as a scapegoat trap.
Absolutely.
And by extension,
And that
so
was
Islam as part of their divide and conquer strategy.
Yes, and that was expressly stated in the Gospel of Judas and in the Apocalypse of Abraham, which was written at the same time as the Gospel of Mark, the first Gospel. So it was obviously always the plan that this Messiah, and there are passages in the Septuagint referred to the fact that this Messiah will be the winepress treading demon that will come down and kill all the Gentiles so that their souls can be consumed by the Jews and by the gods. And this is why the blood is used as the Eucharist. That also goes back to the Egyptians, to the god Shesmu, who is the winepress treading god, the cannibal god who kills all other gods, just as Jesus kills all the pagan gods.
It was considered a vampiric god.
Absolutely.
Feasted on the blood of the enemies.
Yes, and I think that is where the figure of this Messiah is derived in Isaiah chapter 63, that then became Jesus Christ in Revelation chapter 19, treading the winepress. The Christ returns as the Antichrist to kill off all the Christians and punish them for 2,000 years of anti-Semitism.
Yeah, Isaiah is a very important book for laying out their like New World Order plan for subjugating the Gentiles.
Oh, absolutely. It talks about the fact that they'll eat the riches of the Gentiles, take all the property that the Gentiles produce, and that there will be a new heavens and a new earth, which is referred to in Kabbalah as Olam Haba, the world to come, which was also discussed by the Christians, the world to come.
So another idea that you've unearthed is this idea that Satan is the patriarch of non-Jews and Cain was the first non-Jew.
Yes,
do you
Cain
think that
is the product of the serpent copulating with Eve, and this was taught by the Gnostics before it was taught by the Kabbalists, and that Gentiles derive from that. But what the Kabbalists say is that the Cain and Satan have the very highest soul. They believe that Satan has the soul of Tohu, of nothingness, of chaos, which is the ultimate soul, the very highest soul. And that Gentiles, as the firstborn, inherit this wonderful soul and have to be killed off. So that soul is freed from the prison of the Gentiles and can then be assimilated by the Jews, just as Shezmu crushes the heads of the enemies of the Egyptians, so that their blood, which blood represents the soul, can be consumed by the gods and give the gods the energy of the highest form of energy.
So do you think that the genocide of the Canaanites in Deuteronomy and Joshua, do you think that's like a microcosm of the Jewish plan to exterminate Gentiles? Because Cain is regarded as the first goy, and the Canaanites are like an example of like a microcosm of Jewish extermination campaigns, for example, against the Armenians or in the USSR under the Jewish Bolsheviks.
Absolutely, yes. And it's not just the Canaanites, but the 7 nations that are mentioned in Deuteronomy 7 and 20. And it not only, I lost my train of thought. I'm sorry.
You're okay.
So this appears in many ways, is repeated. What I was going to say is that's also brought up in regards to the Egyptians and the slaughter of the firstborn. The Pharaoh represents chaos and the firstborn, and Satan, and the Egyptian pyramids, the Ben represent mounds of chaos from which the order of the world is derived.
What do you think is the most important book of the Bible? I personally, I subscribe to the supplementary hypothesis. I think that the Deuteronomic source is probably the oldest, around 600 BCE. But if you had to choose
Deuteronomy
one book,
is also broken up into several periods.
Right. If you had to choose one book of the Bible to be the most important, which book?
I think Deuteronomy, I would agree, is one of the most important, and it's very important in Kabbalah because the Kabbalists date the 6,000 years of creation to each verse of the Bible. And the era that we're in and the era of the restoration of the Jews in 1948 all relates to Deuteronomy and the passages in Deuteronomy. And the renowned Kabbalist, the Gaon of Vilna, stated that each one of these passages represents what happens in that given year on the Hebrew calendar. For example, 5708 is, 30 verse 5, which talks about the return of the Jews, and that's 1948 on our calendar. So they timed it to exactly match the plan of Deuteronomy. Deuteronomy also talks about taking over the world with usury. Deuteronomy talks about becoming the head and not the tail, and about exterminating all of the Gentiles. And Deuteronomy, if we date it to the Septuagint to about 270 BC, created the plan for the diaspora so that the Jews would be scattered throughout the world and could then infiltrate all the governments of the world and take them over from within and pit them against one another. And that
Yeah.
plan was carried out in 70 AD by the crypto-Jew Tiberius Julius Alexander of the family of Philo-Judaeus, which was the wealthiest family in the world. And
Yeah.
Philo-Judaeus created the incorporation of the Platonic Logos into Judaism to create what became Christianity. So in all of those senses, Deuteronomy is tremendously important. It anticipated and set the plan for the diaspora. It set the plan for utilizing usury to take over the world. And it set the plan for the complete annihilation of the Gentiles. And it gave the chronological schedule which the Kabbalists are following. But there are many very important passages in Genesis, many important passages about the separation of the Jews from the Gentiles in Leviticus, and the story of the Exodus and the story of the destruction of the Amalekites and the story of Joshua. All of those are also very, very significant.
Yeah, absolutely. Something I'm curious about, on the cover of Beware the World to Come, you have an image of the clip-off, and the bottom circle is like highlighted in red. And
that's the Sephirot, not the Klippot.
Okay, so what's the difference?
The Sephirotic tree of life is the holy tree. It represents the tree of life in the Garden of Eden, and it is now upright. The Kalipotic tree of life forms the roots of the unified tree. So you can view the Sephirotic tree as to what is currently the trunk and the branches.
Okay.
And you can view the Kalipotic tree. The Kalipot are the shells, which are the opposite vessels of the Sephirot. The Sephirot contain the holy light. The Kalipot absorbs that holy light when the serpent brings it down from the upper tree into the roots to nourish the tree. A tree absorbs its light through its leaves, which is now the Sephirot, and sends that energy into the roots, which is the Kalipot. Once those vessels absorb all of that divine light, the darkness begins to shine. The Jews believed that originally the moon shined like the sun by itself, and now it only reflects the light of the sun. But in the end times, in the world to come, the moon will become luminescent and the two trees will reverse. And then the Kalipotic tree will be the tree that rises and basks in the moonlight when evil triumphs over good, and good will be buried in the dung heap. And there will be a great reversal. And that is when the Gentiles are exterminated. Their soul of chaos is stolen from them and absorbed by the Jews. And the Kalipotic vessels are filled with the light and the darkness shines. And that is why there is an eighth candle on the menorah, which lights the other 7 candles, because it represents the time at which the darkness will shine. And in Genesis, in the first chapter, it discusses the fact that there are 2 forms of light. There is the light of the darkness, and there is the daylight. The Jews want the Kabbalists, most Jews have no conception of any of this, and I don't want to burden them with the guilt of this because they don't understand it. But the Kabbalistic Jews believe that the dark light is more energized and is better and will ultimately triumph in the cycle of creation when chaos gets rid of the yoke of order and the devil comes to rule. And at that time, they want to kill all the other gods, become the gods themselves when the fruit of the tree of knowledge is ripe. And then they will utilize their divine intellect to form chaos into whatever type of world it is that they want to construct. So they will become gods themselves. And they're already discussing the idea that they are now creating superior forms of life to the forms of life that Satan and Yahweh created, and that they can now get rid of the Torah. The Torah has been fulfilled. It was only for the initial 6 days of creation, and they can utilize the oral Torah, which is Kabbalah.
If I may interject here about in terms of like reaping the souls of Gentiles in a new era, is what you're describing what a lot of heretical Christians call the rapture? Is that
It
what
could
is
be
that
in
what
a
it's
sense.
describing?
I've never thought of it that way, but that's a good insight. That could certainly be why it is that the Kabbalists implanted this concept of the rapture through the Ignatius, Loyola, and the Jesuits, and Lacunza and Rivera, and they wanted to incorporate this into dispensationalism to dupe the Christians into allowing themselves to be killed and welcoming their own death with the mistaken belief that their souls would be raptured, which is, in fact, as you are stating, the harvesting of those souls for Shesmu, for Jesus Christ, so that he can make wine of them and feed them to Yahweh, which in practical Kabbalistic terms means so that the Jews, Jacob, can absorb the soul of Esau, which is the reincarnated soul of Cain, which is the devil's soul, into themselves and become complete. So the second born, Jacob, can absorb the primordial chaos soul of Tohu, which is the firstborn, Cain and Esau, and then become balanced and complete like yin and yang.
In addition to that, before I was going to also say that a lot of things in the Kabbalah are congruent, it sounds like, with the Silicon Valley sort of notion of living forever and transhumanism. It seems there's a lot of congruency there in terms of those two.
Both in terms of their treatment of Gentiles and in terms of their treatment of Jews. Going way back to the ancients, we have the evolution of the concept of creating homunculi in glass flasks from male semen alone. They didn't believe that there would be a female seed involved. The female was only the vessel. They have now created artificial vessels to replace the womb. They view childbirth as a curse, and they have found ways of turning male skin cells into female egg cells so that males can produce their own children from their own DNA and exclude females who are viewed as the left-hand side of evil. So in terms of Jewry, what they want to do is create 600,000 immortal androgynes in the equivalent of these homunculi glass flasks. They are developing the technology to do that. They are also developing it so that they will be essentially immortal unless killed, and that they will be androgynous. They have conducted the experiments to produce these chimera. In terms of Gentiles and transhumanism and posthumanism, again, what they are doing is driving down the soul of Gentiles from the level of soul to the level of animals, then the level of plants, then minerals, and finally matter. And silicone is a mineral, so that by implanting silicone chips into Gentiles, they are stealing the soul of the Gentiles and reducing them on the great chain of being down that ladder to the rung of the material world on the way to nullifying them and making them nothingness. They are also gaining control over their thoughts. There will be a singularity, which will be a massive computer that controls the thoughts and the actions of all the post-human Gentile slaves, so that they therefore become the gods who give order to chaos. Gentiles will be reduced to the level of chaos as matter, and then it will be the intellect of the Jews, which is the highest on the rung of the great chain of being, which will then order that chaos and issue its order to the Gentile slaves.
Interesting.
Yeah, it's just unadulterated evil. I mean, here's another passage from page 37.
And they admit that, and they revel in that fact that evil is good. That is the basis of Jewish dualism. And Shabbatayanism says that evil has to triumph. And the Talmud said that in order for the Messiah to arrive, the world has to become completely evil or completely good. And obviously, their intention is to make it completely evil.
Here's a quote from page 37 of your book. According to the Kabbalistic doctrines of the Sitra Yamina, good right-hand side, and Sitra Achra, evil other side, everything Jewish is holy and good, including evil, and has a truly evil Gentile counterpart, the other side. The evil Gentile counterpart to Jacob's 12 tribes on the other side of Gentiles is Ishmael's 12 sons and the warlike tribes they spawned. Judaism teaches that Muslims are Ishmaelites. Ishmael was a wild and belligerent man, constantly at war with everyone else.
And that plays right into the Armenian Genocide, because it was
Yes.
the Ishmaelites that they sicked on the Christians to exterminate them. And they promised them all the booty and bounty that they could rob from the deceased Armenians. The Armenians were a wealthy minority in the Ottoman Empire. They were resented for that. They were massacred in the 1894 to 1896, and again in the Adana massacres in 1909. And
What do you think of the idea that Jews invented Islam?
I
That
think
they
they
wrote the
do invent
Quran?
Islam, and there are many Jews who have said that, and I provide the citations in my book.
Yeah, you
And
mentioned
there's
if I may-
also a poem.
If I may
about
interject on that,
plagiarism.
was that through the Prophet Muhammad's wife, Khadijah?
Yes. And if the Prophet Muhammad ever existed, yes. But he was also surrounded by Jews. When I started to study the Quran, I found many, many, many
So-
things related to the Talmud and to the oral tradition of the Jews within it.
And
And the idea was to get rid of the Romans out of Judea so that the Arabs could take over and allow the Jews
Right.
to take Jerusalem.
there's a difference between classical Arabic and modern Arabic. Arabic is written right to left like Hebrew.
Yes.
Yeah.
And,
and like all of
the Arabs
ideas
were
are sourced
warlike
from-
people, so they knew that they could exploit the Arabs as a force against Christendom and against the Persians,
Yeah.
and utilize them to take over the peninsula and take over
Here's a quote
Palestine.
from page 38. The Jews created the behemoth Islam in order to pit it as a hostile warrior force against the Leviathan Christendom, so that the two Gentile superpowers, the left and right hand of the evil other side, Sitra Achra, would mutually consume each other in their Jewish instigated wars against one another. This was intended to leave the Jews, the holy Sitra Yamina, or right-hand side, standing as lone heirs to the entire earth. The Middle Eastern wars between Christian Zionist Americans and Islam were the most recent manifestations of this plan to have the Leviathan and Behemoth slay one another for the benefit of Israel. The Jewish instigated attack of Muslim Turks and Kurds against Christian Armenians, Greeks, and Assyrians was another instance of their plan in action.
Absolutely, yes. Thank you
Yeah.
for quoting that. That's very significant.
Yeah.
There was a poem, I think it was in the 8th century, called Akdamut, which talked about this war
Yeah.
between the Behemoth and the Leviathan, which are both described in the book of Job. The Behemoth is the implement of God, and the Muslims are ruled over by the Messiah, son of David, who misdirects them so that they destroy themselves fighting the Christians. And the Christians are ruled over by the Leviathan, Samael, Jesus Christ, who is the serpent of chaos. So what they're doing is pitting those two forces against one another so that they kill each other. And it states in the book of Job that the Leviathan will eventually be consumed and eaten by its followers. And hence we have the Eucharist of Jesus Christ, the Leviathan being consumed by the Christians. And this is referred to in the mythology of the wedding banquet of Jesus Christ, at which time he will be consumed. And in the Talmud, in Bava Batra, folio 74a, where the Jews will consume the Leviathan and the Behemoth in the world to come. Now, what all this is mystical gobbledygook, which is interpreted by the practical Kabbalists to mean that what's going to happen is that the Christians and the Muslims will slay one another, and their blood will be absorbed by the earth. Many of the ancients had the conception that the human body, when it dies, rots back into the chaos which produced it. And it is only the holy order of the gods which gives life, form, and breath to that clay of the earth. So the earth is like a sponge that brings things back into chaos. And that is what Muslims are to do to Christians, and Christians are to do to Muslims. And that is what the wedding banquet is all about, is these two forces, the Behemoth and the Leviathan, exterminating one another.
Right.
And a related belief that the Kabbalists have in Deuteronomy, chapter 22, verse 10, it talks about, thou shalt not plow with an ox and an ass together. And this relates to the Christians as the ox and the Muslims, Ishmael, as the donkey or the ass. And they are terribly afraid that this violent force that they deliberately created of the Ishmaelites will combine with the Edomites, Esau, Christendom, against the Jews. So they cannot allow these two animals to plow together in the same field. They have to pit them against one another, or they will unite and destroy the Jews themselves.
That's a good point. And you also talk about how Jews supported Muslims, like elite Jews supported Muslims, antagonism against Gentiles historically. Quote from page 33 of your book: Jews opened the gates of many Christian cities to Muslim conquerors and sold Christian females to Muslims and the Chinese as sex slaves for many centuries. Jews closed the gates of Toledo, Spain, to fleeing Catholics and opened them to the invading Muslims under Tariq ibn Ziyad. Jewish armies led by Nehemiah ben Hushiel and Benjamin of Tiberias joined with Persians to slaughter Byzantine Christians and destroy their churches and holy sites during the Sasanian conquest of Jerusalem in 614 AD. Jews then benefited from the Arab conquest of Jerusalem over the Persians in 636. And for example, Stanford J. Shaw documented many instances where Jews helped the Muslim Ottoman Turks to conquer several Christian cities in Europe in his book, The Jews of the Ottoman Empire and the Turkish Republic.
Absolutely. That's very significant history, because that's what happened again in the Armenian Genocide. And that relates to the idea that the ox and the donkey should not plow together. The Armenians and the Turks had gotten along very well together. The Armenians sustained the Turkish Empire. And that prevented the Jews from taking Palestine, because Sultan Abdul Hamid II refused to sell Palestine to the Rothschild family, which offered to buy it and pay off the debts that the Jews themselves had caused the Turks to incur. So they wanted to pit the ox and the donkey against one another, the Leviathan and the Behemoth, so that the Behemoth would slay the Leviathan, and that would then free up Palestine for the Jews to take. And the ambassador Morgenthau specifically stated that after they had killed the Armenians, that the Armenians were now all dead, that the Armenians had run the Ottoman Empire, and that the Jews had to step in and take their place. So what they were doing was that they were siding with the Muslims against the Christians and replacing the Christians and ensuring that there was animosity between Christians and Muslims, because this not only pitted the Ottoman Empire, which was run by the Caliphate of the Muslims, against the Christians, it then pitted the Western Christians against the Ottoman Empire for the fact that the Ottomans had slayed the Armenian, Greek, and Assyrian Christians, and that played a big role in World War I.
And here's a relevant quote to that from page 77. Many Jews wanted to unseat the Sultan because he refused to give Palestine over to the Zionists. It is well known that the pioneering and principal Zionist Theodor Herzl sought to extort the Sultan. The Sultan had committed atrocities which the Jews could exploit to bring pressure against the empire by using their control of the press to call for reprisals against the Ottomans from Europe and America. Herzl informed the Sultan that the Jews controlled the press and could help or hurt the empire depending upon whether or not the Sultan helped the Zionists to take Palestine. They could bury the story of Turkish atrocities and praise the Sultan, or they could spread banner headlines around the world condemning the Sultan and the empire mass murdering Christians on the pretext that they were revolutionaries and agents of the enemies of the Ottoman Empire.
And that fact was exposed in the Encyclopedia Britannica. I think either in its article on Armenia or on Zionism or both.
Yeah.
And they stated it in those express terms, that it was an extortion against the Sultan. And Herzl discussed it frequently. He discussed it in his address in 1897 in Basel, Switzerland. He discussed it in his diaries, and he discussed it in his book, The Jewish State, how that they could pay off the debts of the Ottoman Empire and then utilize it for the benefit of that. And then in private, he would discuss the idea that If they didn't do that, they would utilize their control of the Jewish press to smear the Sultan.
And ultimately break up the Ottoman Empire, which at that
That
time
was a
had
huge part of it because they wanted to take Palestine. The Ottoman Empire, the Sultan not only controlled Palestine, but he controlled the Caliphate, which is the ruling, it's like the Pope and the Vatican of Islam. He unified Islam under his control as the head of the Caliphate. The Young Turks rejected the Caliphate, and it was Mustafa Kemal Ataturk that eventually completely got rid of the Caliphate and made the Turks into radical nationalists who rejected their imperial power and voluntarily gave up their entire empire and restricted themselves to essentially Anatolia, whereas they had controlled a vast empire surrounding the Mediterranean.
So how did you initially discover this information back in 2000, around 2006 or before then? Because you found a lot of primary sources that validate this.
There was a great deal of discussion of it. And when I was researching Zionism in the London Times, I found all of these articles and correspondence which were initiated by the Vienna correspondent to the London Times. And I eventually figured out that this information was being provided by Sir Gerard Lothar, who was the ambassador to the Ottoman Empire. And he wrote letters which very clearly spelled out exactly what was going on, who was behind it, the fact that the Young Turks were in fact crypto-Jews and Freemasons and regular Jews. They weren't all crypto-Jews. Emmanuel Carasso, for example, the one who established the Macedonia Resorta Lodge in Salonika, Freemasonic Lodge, and who arranged for the financing of the Young Turks, and with Dr. Nazim helped to create the Committee of Union and Progress, which eventually ordered the extermination of the Armenians. He was a regular Jew. He was not a Derme.
Yeah.
So that was, once I had read that stuff, it was very clear, but I saw mentions of it in many, many sources. This was well known at the time, and I had been investigating the First World War and what had gone on in the First World War. Benjamin Freeman gave a famous speech at the Wilford Hotel or something where he discussed the Balfour Declaration. The Balfour Declaration was engineered by an Armenian named James Aratun Malcolm. And I looked into his connections to Zionism and other things. And that also led me down the path of the Young Turks. So there was a confluence of many things which brought me to an understanding of all that. And I first started discussing it in my book, The Manufacture and Sale of St. Einstein, which I published at the very tail end of 2005, added about 30 pages, and republished it in January of 2006. And I discussed the fact that the Young Turks were Jewish Freemasons.
Yeah.
And then it inspired me to write my book on it. But it was the London Times articles that really, really spelled it out. And then after that, when I got a hold of Sir Gerard Lothar's letters, it was crystal clear what had happened.
Yeah. You want to interject, Pat?
I want to ask, basically, do you consult direct sources in terms of Kabbalistic inquiry? Or, what do you rely upon when you research the Kabbalah and in regards to the Midrash and a lot of the other sources? I'm just curious.
I do discuss the primary sources. Well, let me answer this in a historical sense. I initially learned the most about the Kabbalah from Johannes Andreas Eisenmenger's book, Judaism Unveiled. And I read both in English and in German what he had written about the Kabbalah and all of the sources that he had cited. And I looked into the Shulchan Aruch. I looked into Etz Chaim, the Tree of Life, by Isaac Luria. I looked into Shara HaGegulim, The Gate of Reincarnations by Isaac Luria. I studied that. I studied the Zohar, and I was guided by Johannes Buxdorf and Johannes Andreas Eisenmenger's work on that. Pranaitis also had many sources that he derived from those great German scholars. In his book, The Talmud Unmasked, which also lists Zoharic sources and other Kabbalistic sources, I most recently found something called the Galia Raza, which is very significant because it admits that the goal of Judaism is to completely exterminate the Gentiles, and that they have to secretly flatter the Gentiles, enter in and mislead the Gentiles into killing off themselves because they are outnumbered, and they must utilize the power of the Gentiles as a hammer with which to smash the Gentiles.
Wow.
And the Galia Raza is explicit in describing that in great detail.
Yeah, the hammer and the sickle, the hammer of the Maccabees and the sickle of Saturn.
Yes, Kronos.
Yeah.
Who castrates Uranus. It's always the son of the gods slays the gods, and the Jews are ultimately the sons of the gods and must slay the gods and become gods themselves.
You talk about that, how the Jews plan to kill Yahweh because the relationship between the relationship is that Jews fear Yahweh, and it's not a relationship of love.
Yes, Yahweh is a classical cacodemon, and this was by no means unique to Judaic beliefs. The Romans had a cacodemon, Vejovis, who was the opposite of Jove. When they would give sacrifices before battle, they would give sacrifices both to the cacodemon Vejovis, they would give 3 black sheep, and to the great loving god Jove, they would give 3 white sheep, so that they had both forces, evil and good, working for them to destroy their enemies. Jews have the exact same belief. They destroyed that supernatural protection among Gentiles with Christianity by making Gentiles reject their satanic protection and instead embrace Jesus, so that they only got 1/2 and therefore would die out.
You state in your book,
and please, may I interject one last thing?
Sure.
Anyone who honestly reads the Old Testament will read that the Jews always rejected Yahweh, hated Yahweh, and were punished for it. So they only pretended to love Yahweh to gain his supernatural protection. And that is a recurrent theme throughout the Old Testament, is that the Jewish people hate Yahweh. Yahweh only issues curses against them.
Yeah, like in Deuteronomy, the curses.
Absolutely. And Deuteronomy begins with a curse, which is stated in the exact same terms as a Roman curse. And I quote that in my Satanic Secrets of Jesus Christ series, how those 2 quotes are identical, virtually identical. So Yahweh is clearly a cacodemon. The Gnostics also made that crystal clear when they identified Yahweh as Yaldabaoth, the demiurge, the destructive creator god, who is an ineffectual god, an inept god who created an evil creation, and that he has to be killed off, and the soul has to be elevated to a higher level, where the throne of the gods on earth has to be elevated to the thrones of the gods in the heavens, that the human soul has to migrate across the 7 planets and across the stars to reunite with the gods, and that Yahweh's creation has to be destroyed. And Yahweh himself has to be defeated and destroyed, so that they no longer have to pretend to honor this cacodemon.
Do you think there is any wisdom at all in Judaism? Do any of the stories hold any water, just as like parables, or are they all racist garbage?
I think there's some beautiful poetry, certainly. I think a lot of it was derived from the Greeks, from the Egyptians and others, but it is no doubt well stated and beautiful both in its concept and its expression. And I think art stands on its own. Just as there may be a musician who I personally dislike, I can still honor their music and enjoy it. And I do think there are verses of wisdom within both the Old Testament and the New, certainly. And I don't think that that should be lost or rejected simply based on the fact that it's part of this hateful mythology. But I do think that it is a a distortion of something far more beautiful, which was expressed by the Greeks, which isn't based on this xenophobia and hatred of humanity, and which doesn't portray the nature of human beings as fundamentally evil. So I think it can be utilized as a stepping stone into some of the more beautiful things that the Greeks had. And the Greeks always understood in their mystery schools that this was mythology, that it was symbolic of human psychology and human nature and of how the cosmos functioned, and that it was put into these anthropomorphic terms so that it could be readily understood by devotees and disciples of these beliefs. And I think that we need to transcend the evil of Judaism and get back to the beauty of what the Greeks produced would be a great step forward. But to not step back into the darkness of mythology, but to understand it as they understood it, as metaphorical, allegorical, and symbolic of the true nature of the universe and the true nature of human psychology. And I think the Greeks expressed it even better, more poetically, more beautifully, and in a way which is more readily understood by Gentiles, which doesn't make them hate themselves. It doesn't teach them to hate childbirth, to view it as an evil curse, bringing death. It doesn't cause them to believe that the flesh is a corpse that must be rotted away. And I think there are much better paths to follow than Christianity, Judaism, and Islam.
Well, these Semitic religions arguably introduced this shame-based morality, so like a binary dualistic morality. How do you think this differs from pre-Christian Indo-European morality and metaphysics?
Well, there are various systems of thought. The Greeks, for example, did not try to destroy the idea that they were a unique people. They had to preserve themselves. They had to love their families and their children, that childbirth was a beautiful thing, that it was good to be clever and to have guile and be intelligent and to deceive your enemies, not love them, to defend your cities, not hand them over to others, and that it was a beautiful thing to be Greek, and that the Greek gods were the greatest gods, which is why they empowered the Greeks to create their vast empire. Their empire became a mistake because they imported slaves who degraded the genius of their blood, and their empire slowly started to crumble as these slaves brought in their own culture and eroded the genius of the Greek people. Same thing had happened to the Egyptians. Same thing had happened to the Sumerians, Akkadians, and Babylonians. Same thing happened to the Romans. So there were mistakes made, and we should learn from those mistakes, but we should also take great pride in the great genius of those peoples, and we should celebrate them instead of, as Christianity says, reject them as evil pagans who were damned to hell.
Just to piggyback off that question, let me ask you, Mr. Bjerknes, how far back do you think does this Judaic sort of influence go back in Western civilization? Where do you think the epoch of this was?
I think it really started to gain strength in Alexandria, Egypt. Alexandria had a great many Jews. It had many more Jewish scholars and a lot more Jewish money than Jerusalem itself. And I think it was around the 4th century BC when this started to emerge. They took a lot from Plato and the Greek mystery religions, and they flipped them on their head, and something amazing happened in North Egypt at that time, which is where Alexandria is situated. The Greeks came up with the mythology of Serapis, combining Apis with another Egyptian god to create a hybrid religion, which essentially taught the Egyptians and the others in North Africa to worship what was fundamentally a Greek god. And the Jews picked up on that and created the mythology of Christianity as a means of gaining control over the mentality of the Romans and the Greeks. And they simply utilized the methods that they learned from the Greeks against the Greeks themselves and ultimately usurped them. So I think that was the primary region. Septuagint was written in Alexandria, Egypt. It contained the entire plan for the ultimate destruction of the Gentile world. It contained the plan for the infiltration of the Gentile world through the diaspora and dispersal of the Jews throughout the world. And the Alexandrian Jews then came into conflict. There was a conflict between the Pharisees and the Sadducees and the primacy of the temple. The Alexandrian Jews set about to destroy the temple and did so in 70 AD under the direction of the Alexandrian Jew of the family of Philo-Judaeus, Tiberius Julius Alexander, who became a Roman general, and under the Romans destroyed part of the Alexandria Jewish quarter and Jerusalem itself.
Interesting. Very fascinating.
And the Alexandria Jews were immersed in the mystery religions of the Orphics, the Eleusinians, and the Samothracians, which were very popular among the elite of the Greeks, the Romans, the Egyptians, and the Jews.
Very interesting. That does seem to be a trend, how they infiltrate various different societies and civilization. They usually are peddling some kind of order or some kind of mystical knowledge and dispersing it to the populace. They've done that all the way from antiquity, some would argue in ancient Egypt, all the way into the medieval era in Europe.
And they often do it as a utopian vision.
Oh, yes.
And the Christians were the first Marxists.
Are you familiar or acquainted with a book called The Jewish Utopia?
Absolutely. Michael Higger was a rabbi, I think it was 1928 or the 1932, somewhere in that period. His book has the best set of references I've ever found on the Jewish plan to exterminate the Gentiles. He lays it out clearly. He says there's a division of thought as to what will happen in the Jewish utopia. The Jewish utopia is Olam Haba, the world to come. And he wants to make it appear that there's a possibility that Noahides and righteous Gentiles will be spared. But he also plainly states that there's also another school of thought that they will be completely eradicated. That is clearly the school of thought of the Shabbatians and the Kabbalists in general. It's only reformist Jews who have a different perspective, but they were created also as a means of infiltrating German society. Moses Mendelssohn and the Haskalah were all, and I've seen Hasidic rabbis discuss this, and Karl Marx himself, it was all a setup to create these atheistic, essentially Jews, so that they could infiltrate German society, sit down at the same tables as Gentiles and eat with them, which is forbidden in Leviticus, and gain access and create liberal laws which would allow them to utilize human freedom to enslave Gentiles.
And you discuss how Jews usurp and infiltrate in your book and how this is inspired by biblical allegory. So, quote from page 15, in the biblical account of the twins Esau and Jacob, Jacob wears goat skins to resemble his hairy brother Esau in order to steal his birthright. Blessings in Esau's soul by imitating him before their blind father Isaac, who mistakenly took Jacob for Esau and bestowed Esau's firstborn blessing on secondborn Jacob. The story of Esau and Jacob and that of Esther and Haman were allegorical lessons which teach Jews to change their names, pretend to be Gentiles, or feign religious conversion, and thereby fool Gentiles into believing that they are also Gentiles. They do this in order to infiltrate Gentile society and government and commit atrocities against non-Jews without being detected as Jews. Anam ben David, the Marano Jews in Spain, Shabbatai Zevi, Jacob Frank, and the Don May imitated the biblical crypto Jews Jacob and Esther. Jacob was the first crypto Jew. I think that's a great point.
Yes, and they called themselves the Young Turks in the Ottoman Empire to conceal the fact that they were Jewish. And the Dermay always pretended to be Muslims. And one of the ways that people could spot them as Dermay was the fact that they were the most devout Muslims. They honored every letter of the Quran and every intricate detail of Muslim practice.
Do you think the elite Jews are basically a monolith, or do you think there are different camps of elite Jews, like, say, Zionist Jews versus more materialistic Jews?
The strength
Nowadays.
of their pyramid is built on a hierarchical structure. They're the opposite of being monolithic, except at the very top. They depend upon creating a diversity of beliefs among the lesser Jews, their lower brethren, as they refer to them, so that they can control every aspect of the culture and thought of the Gentile world. They have to enter into and infiltrate every single aspect of cultural evolution among the Gentiles and guide it to conform to their plans, just as Christianity did. So it was Christianity was initially a Jewish movement led by Jews, filled with Jews, and they utilized that as a means of then implanting it into the Gentile world. So you will have Jews on every side of an issue. Many of them may be very nice, very sincere people, but they are part of a malicious scheme to control the debate in every way to favor the Jewish agenda of exterminating the Gentiles. A good example of that was Supreme Court Justice Ruth Bader Ginsburg, who was quoted in a book as stating that every decision she made was based upon the question, is it good for the Jews?
Really? Wow.
Yes, not based upon the Constitution, not based upon what was morally or legalistically correct, but based upon whether or not it was good for the Jews. And that is a common expression among Jews that they are taught from the cradle to the grave. Whenever confronted with an issue, a political issue, or anything else, the first question they must ask, is it good for the Jews, when proposing their opinion and their proposed solution, or their judgment or determination.
You mentioned, I think Marshall mentioned something about crypsis, which is an absolutely interesting phenomenon, which the Jews have perfected throughout the ages. I'm curious, in terms of like their crypsis in the Islamic world versus the Western world, what were some of the differences in adaptation to the Islamic world versus the Western world in terms of their crypsis?
They viewed their golden age as when they were among the Moorish and North African Muslims. It was their greatest period in history. The rabbis discussed the fact that Islam is nearly a perfect form of Noahidism. They obey the 7 laws of Noah, and one of those 7 laws is that the punishment for idolaters is to be decapitated, which means that ultimately the Muslims must decapitate the Armenians and Christians in general. So it was set up to fulfill the Noahide laws, which were established in the Babylonian Talmud in the tractate Sanhedrin, folios 56 to 60. And Islam was engineered to be the fulfillment of those 7 Noahide laws and to create what they called righteous Gentiles, who would be the Muslim slaves, outdoing and exterminating the Christians in their obedience to the Abrahamic faiths, and being that wild man Ishmael, who would go around the world and destroy everything and convert all the pagans into Noahides.
Well, in terms of like Sufism, is Sufism somewhat of a natural expression, let's say, of esoteric Islam? And I'm guessing the Sufi sect you were talking about with the Domne, please excuse me if I'm mispronouncing these words, that they adopted in Turkey, was that kind of a variation of the Bektashi order?
Sufi that is order? The Bektashi order. They were Sufis in Turkey. Talat Pasha was a very prominent Bektashi. He was identified as such by in a book called Effendi, written in Turkish, citing a very prominent Dernme scholar named Bali, who said that Talat was Bektashi and was Dernme. Sufism is very much related to Kabbalah, which is in turn related to Neoplatonism and the mystery religions and Gnosticism. There was an early split in Islam by the relatives and followers of Muhammad. You had the Shia who adhered strictly to the Quran, and then you had the Shia who adopted the Hadith and created a split in Islam and created interpretations of the Quran. The Quran is much more clearly, very clearly Talmudistic and the oral tradition of Judaism. And it states very strange things about
the Quran
Moses,
and
Miriam, and Aaron. I'm sorry, please go ahead.
Go ahead, Marshall. Marshall?
He's frozen on my screen.
Yeah, unfortunately, I think we lost him. But continuing and going off that, what are like some of the central kind of features between you were elaborating about Sufism and Bektashi
You have
Sufism?
the whirling dervishes in Turkey who are Sufis.
Yes.
And related to the spinning of the planets. And you have the Muslims walking around the Kaaba 7 times in concentric circles. All of this relates to that idea that the soul has to migrate across the 7 planets, which goes way back to the Mithraic religions and the mystery schools.
Interesting. Let me see if I can try to get Marshall back in here, but while he's gone, I didn't anticipate this, but let's continue on since we're making good progress here. That's interesting. You mentioned
Jews are
about
much more comfortable living among Muslims. They do not want Christians to win this war between Muslims and Christians. The whole set of Middle Eastern wars was instigated by Trotskyite neoconservative Jews in the United States, not to destroy Islam, but to destroy the United States and the West, Christendom, Edom, with these self-consuming wars. They are constantly trying to drive us into debt and self-consuming wars. So it was not just a war to give Israel hegemony, it was also a war to bring down the U.S.
Interesting. Also, circling back to the Islam, I think you mentioned something about apocalyptic type of event that's mentioned in the Quran. I believe that's called the Year of the Elephant, and the Year of the Elephant is where there was a raid upon Mecca. It was known as it was this Christian leader from Abyssinia named Abriha, and he stormed Mecca, and this was quite a traumatic event for the Arabians, and this signified kind of as the apocalypse to the Arabs and to the Islamic world. Is that accurate?
I'm not that familiar with what you're discussing, but there's a book in the Quran on the Romans and how the Romans had to be defeated, but then would become united and together with Islam. So what they want to do is eventually defeat Europe, infiltrate it, and make it Islamic.
Well,
in terms of the apocalypse, all of that relates to Jesus, who they refer to as Isa, and the Mahdi, and there are different apocalyptic visions among the Sunni and the Shia.
Yeah, and one thing that interests me about sort of Semitic and Judaic spirituality and their religions is that the eschatological underpinnings, a lot of them, is sort of finite and it is linear, as opposed to, pre-Islamic, pre-Christian traditions. It's more, let's just say, it's more cyclical in nature. And I'm wondering,
It's very dogmatic. The way that they adhere, like Talmudic Jews, to the Quran strips them of their humanity and occupies their mind with these abstractions, which have absolutely nothing to do with reality.
Okay, he's back. But just to further elaborate on that, Mr. Bjerknes, I'm curious, in terms of like this difference, the eschatological sort of difference between the two cultures, why do you think that is? Why do you think there is like sort of a difference between, let's just say, Indo-European
I can't wait to
And
answer. I'm going to keep
okay.
interrupting till you let me answer.
just let me finish it. Let me finish it. In terms of Vedic, in terms of like even the Norse and even the various different like pre-Christian traditions, their traditions are not finite. They are cyclical. They see like an afterbirth and a rebirth of a new world, and it's much more optimistic, I would say, than the Judaic conceptions of eschatological.
Eschatological.
Yes, eschatological. Go ahead, Mr. Bjerknes.
That's a wonderful question. The eschatology of the Abrahamic faith and of the fourth Abrahamic faith, Marxism, all end up at the same place. And that same place is the destruction of the world and Jews governing the world in a post-apocalyptic vision of the Jewish remnant and the world being ruled by a Jewish king, the Messiah. So it was all engineered to arrive at the same place. Marxism arrives at a global government, which, as the Marxist David Ben-Gurion stated, would be ruled out of the Supreme Court of mankind in Jerusalem in conformity with Isaiah chapter 2, verses 1-4. Islam and Christianity all complement one another in their destruction of everything, which produces this exact same result. So the eschatology of all of them, just the fact that eschatology exists within each one of those beliefs, and then to add on to that, the fact that they all arrive at the same place shows that they were engineered to achieve the same result, and that Muslims and Christians were simply duped into playing the roles of the behemoth and the Leviathan in Jewish mythology to ultimately produce their own demise and make Jews sole inheritors of the earth. Part of the Jewish tradition of Christianity is that the Christians would wipe out all the pagan religions, create a world empire, which would then be usurped by the Jews themselves, and that the Christ would return as the Antichrist and kill off the Christians. And they openly discuss that. I have passages from Ginsburg and others where they verify that that is in fact the case of what their beliefs are. In terms of the genesis of this eschatology as a cyclical process of initially primordial chaos, which is darkness, formlessness, and void, giving way to a burst of light from a egg, which is hatched as Phanes Protogenes in the Orphic mystery religions, as Ra in the Egyptian beliefs of the sun emerging each day to recreate creation in the same pattern of light emerging in darkness. Light is the holy seed. Darkness is the womb. The holy seed implants itself in the womb to generate creation and give it order from the divine intellect. The ultimate God is composed of both, and it is the unity of that. It is both monism and dualism combined into an ultimate monism of polarity. This results in a process. Chaos resists order, just as slaves resist their master. Chaos seeks its own freedom. This quest for freedom from order, just as the Jews want to get rid of the order of Yahweh, the holy light, giving them the 10 commandments and the law of Moses, produces entropy over the centuries and millennia. In the Jewish system, it is 6 millennia, the 6 days of creation, which are traversed. Chaos increases, and ultimately chaos absorbs all of the holy light and begins to shine. This was stated by Hesiod as metallic ages. You had the initial golden age when the light first bursts and everything is perfectly ordered. Everyone is happy. Nature, which is divine order, provides everything that a human being needs to survive. That gives way to the Silver Age, the Bronze Age, and then the Iron Age and the Age of Heroes. Mankind increasingly gains knowledge of the gods. Knowledge is the science of the gods. Man seeks to become his own God and slay the gods with this knowledge. This results in man acquiring through Prometheus the knowledge of the arts of agriculture, metallurgy, science, mathematics, astrology, etc. This alienates man from nature so that man has to work and slave to produce his own food. He then becomes yoked to the earth as a slave of the earth. The higher intellect peoples move into cities, but they are then again reliant upon their own labor and their own intellect to provide for their sustenance, which is a degradation of the divine order of nature, the Garden of Eden, the Garden of Hesperides, where the gods had provided apples and fruits and animals that we could consume and clothe ourselves with. Instead, we supplant that with our knowledge, which eventually destroys us in the Iron Age. In the Iron Age, man becomes completely corrupt. Brother slays brother. Child hates father. All of this is described in Matthew 21 and Matthew 24 and Luke 21 as the end of the world, which derives from this Hesiod's view of the Iron Age. The Egyptians, Sumerians had similar concepts. And the Talmudists, the Muslims, and the Christians all adopted this concept of the degradation of creation from initial divine order in the Garden of Eden, eroding into Cain and Tubal Cain, creating cities and metallurgy where men slay men. And ultimately, Christ said that every man has to be against his brother, give up his family, hate his parents in order to be a Christian. So he's fulfilling the Iron Age and pitting human beings against one another, which then produces the destruction of the world. The Stoics had an idea that there would be a conflagration of the universe at the end. Everything would be burned up like the phoenix, and that would clear the slate of chaos for a new form of creation.
And
The goal of the Jews is to break this cycle. They do want the darkness to absorb all the light, but they do not want Yahweh to reemerge and give order to chaos. They do not want Phanes Protogenes to become the silver egg, the cosmic egg of a new universe. They want to become gods and create an ordered universe out of chaos themselves and make that the eternal cycle, which is never broken and which never changes.
Let me ask you about Karl Marx in terms of like his influences. How much influence do you think Moses has had over Karl Marx? And the reason why I ask this is because I'm pretty sure you're acquainted with Marxian thought. A lot of it is influenced by Hegel. Hegel is like the central figure in Marx's
Dialectical materialism, yeah.
But Hegel also had kind of an eschatological type of assertion about how history was kind of like a motion and a force, and as it moved,
the divine consciousness moving through great men.
Yeah, and what I was going to ask you is that what people don't realize is that Marxist thought has an accelerationist element to it, to where he sees capitalism materializing until it finally accelerates the destruction and end into a new era of revolutions. That's kind of what Marx was trying to do with the 1848.
And the white nationalists had bought into that and want to destroy themselves with this mythology that
you're
worse
correct.
is better for now.
Not just white nationalists, but Nick Land and some of the other types of the CCRU and people such as that. They have tried to manifest consciousness to bring about acceleration. So what I was going to ask you is, this accelerationist concept, was this imparted upon by him by Hess? Because the reason why I wonder this is because Marx was a Germanophile. Despite being a Jew, despite being kind of a Protestant, he was raised largely Protestant.
Hess was certainly not a Germanophile. Hess
no, he wasn't. But Karl Marx was.
Rome and Jerusalem.
Karl Marx was. But I'm wondering, though, did he impart this accelerationism onto Marx? And was Hegel also influenced by the Kabbalah?
Hegel was absolutely influenced by the Kabbalah. He was influenced by the Illuminists. He was influenced by Spartacus Weishaupt, and this whole notion that great men should shape history. He was influenced by Napoleon, celebrated Napoleon as one of those great men who had the divine consciousness to give order to humanity, that it's great men who make history. History doesn't make great men, and the divine manifests itself through these great men. And he created the mythology, this Germanophile mythology that you discuss, of the Prussians being the highest order of the German people and representing the pinnacle of human evolution into a great society. But this was all a subversion meant to utilize the Prussians as a hammer against the Slavs and against the Roman Catholics of Bavaria and Austria, and to divide the German Empire, as began to happen in the Kulturkampf in the 1870s, and ultimately produce the DDR and West Germany after the communists took over East Germany. So it was a trap to create the idea of pitting the Protestants against the Catholics to divide the German people against themselves. They presented themselves as Germanophiles, but I think they did admire the Germanic people, as Disraeli described them as a noble race, but they viewed them, as the Talmud says, as being the Edomites and being the Amalekites. And they had to ultimately kill them because they were the principal competition to Jewry's goal of taking over the world. So they had to get rid of the German people, and the only way they could do that was by duping the German people into destroying themselves. Marx and Engels wrote against the Slavic peoples and wrote one of the first things to advocate the complete genocide of the Slavs as a garbage race, as they described them.
Marx called the Slavs an ethnic sewer.
I'm sorry?
Marx called the Slavs an ethnic sewer.
Yes, and Friedrich Engels said that in the coming World War, which he described in the 1880s, that this race of garbage would be completely exterminated because they were counter-revolutionary.
So, regarding a world war, some religious Jews believe a third world war is necessary for their Gog and Magog prophecy. What do you
that's
think?
Stated in the Midrash Tehillim 109:9.
What do you think a World War III scenario would look like?
I think we're in it. We're living it. It's going to be biological warfare. It's going to get radiological warfare. They are destroying the human genetics on every level with GMO foods,
which were predicted in the Talmud.
Absolutely, yes, and predicted before the Talmud in Baruch and other very early Jewish writings, which influenced the early Christian authors to talk about grapes that would produce thousands of kegs of wine from a single grape and all other kinds of GMO foods. And the Talmud discussed that. And again, Christian writings and other pre-Christian writings talked about that. I give the sources in my book, Beware the World to Come, especially in the 3rd edition of my book. So I think what it certainly the attacks between Christians and Muslims took place in the First World War, in the Second World War, in the Third World War, which is being a prolonged struggle with the Middle Eastern wars, were part of the Third World War, just as the Balkan Wars were part of the First World War. And I think what it is going to be is the imposition of post-humanism on humanity, as we see happening in China, where children are being wired up to computers with virtual reality headsets being put on their heads, the increasing dehumanization of human beings, the way that TikTok with its 2-minute videos is destroying the attention span of human consciousness to the point where human beings can no longer decipher what is real and what is not real. It is going to be a greater process of demoralization, destruction of the food supply, genetically engineered viruses and bacteria that will destroy our human genetics, render us infertile, change what we are. And at the same time, in Israel, they are developing ways of creating immortal androgynes in laboratories. I think their plans with Russia did not go as they planned in Ukraine. I think the plan was to take Ukraine and then take the rest of Europe. There was an old Leninist scheme, a Marxist scheme of the so-called Atlanticists of England and America being separated from the rest of Europe. David Ben-Gurion talked about the idea of a Eurasian Federation, which would be subservient to Israel and take over all of Europe and Asia. And in order to do that, they want to first destroy America and England, which is why Putin is threatening England with nuclear bombs. And we're in it. We're in the crap. And we have subverted leadership in every one of our nations. Both of the major parties in America are subverted. One is controlled, the Democrats are controlled by Israel and support Red China. The Republicans are controlled by Israel and support Russia. Nobody is supporting the West. Nobody is supporting European nations. Nobody's supporting European culture or the survival of European peoples. And we're doomed because we're screwing up. We're not defending ourselves. We have bought into the Jewish mythology of Christianity. We have created freedoms which are ultimately engineered to rob us of our freedom. And we do not utilize the government to preserve ourselves. The government is instead pitted against the people to destroy our national sovereignties and to eliminate us.
You could argue also with the internet, advent of the internet, they're carving out various different niches, utilizing kind of digital territory, which are being controlled by intelligence agencies, some of which are part of the Jews and some of which are part of centralized CIA and other operatives. And that is carving out sort of a niche to where they can control and really shape geopolitical events as we speak through information and
very good
technology.
point. Absolutely. And that also has a biblical analog in the Tower of Babel. Human beings had organized and passed down their knowledge from generation to generation and united to construct the Tower of Babel, which in the oral tradition of Judaism was made so that human beings could ascend to the gods and slay them with axes. It's related to the story of the Garden of Eden, where the gods became angry when human beings obtained knowledge and then feared that they would eat the tree of life and become immortal like the gods. In both instances, the gods cursed humanity with death. In the instance of the Tower of Babel, they destroyed the tower and made each human being speak a different language, which made it impossible for human beings to unite against the gods and impossible for human beings to pass along their knowledge from generation to generation and from person to person and educate one another. That meant that each generation had to educate itself, which consumed all of their time and prevented them from accruing their knowledge into a greater, perpetual, highly evolved state of knowledge. The same thing is taking place in internet chat rooms where the algorithms and artificial intelligence artificially herd people into echo chambers where they each speak their own language, just as happened with the Tower of Babel. And everyone else's language sounds like Babel to these echo chambers, so that a consensus among humanity can never be reached, knowledge can never be shared, discussions and resolutions cannot be achieved because they feed these people in these echo chambers back only into information which reinforces their own beliefs and their hostility towards other groups. So again, Satan is the great divider. They are atomizing human beings into individual groups. They control the dialogue in each of those groups to favor the Jewish agenda. And humanity is being directed increasingly in this way by artificial intelligence into the same state as, I forget what they called it, the generation of something, where everyone speaks their own language and human beings cannot cooperate and share knowledge.
That does seem to be unfolding before us. And with the internet, the advent of the internet, it does seem a lot of these Kabbalistic principles you're speaking are definitely being coming to a fruition.
I agree. And it's deadly. It is deadly to us. It's killing us. It's destroying our children. And
Go
we
ahead,
have
Marshall.
duty to protect our children from it.
Go ahead, Marshall.
Yeah, I want to ask you about the Kabbalist view of the ages. So you talk about the different ages: Gemini, Aries, Taurus, and Pisces, with the world to come being the age of Aquarius. The researcher Yuri Lena showed that the elites will often plan their crimes when the sun is in the sign of Scorpio. And you mentioned in your book, Forbidden History, the Armenian Holocaust, how Jewish elites have planned disasters on Tisha B'Av. Now, my own research has shown that many infamous Jews, and like commissars in the USSR, rabbis, etc., have really unusual natal charts. And I was wondering if you had any insight into like astrology and Jews, or if you could recommend any sources that relate to that.
Thomas Carlson has written very good books about the left-hand path of Kabbalah and the pursuit of Satanism through Kabbalah. I would recommend his work. It's very well written, very simple, very easily understood.
Yes, I'm familiar with Thomas Carlson. Night Side of the Runes is a good one. Kabbalah, Qliphothe,
and Gurtic Magic.
Yes, those are good books. I'm acquainted with those books.
In terms of the ages, the 6 days of creation are 6,000 years. This is stated in Proverbs and other parts of the Bible, that each day is as 1,000 years. Those 6,000 years are divided into the 2,000-year ages. You had this is all supposedly began with the creation of Adam. It depends on which calendar you're using. If you're using the Anno Lucas calendar that the Shabbatayans and the Freemasons use, the year 2000 was the end of the age of Pisces, which is the fish, which is Leviathan, which is Christianity. You had the age of Aries, the ram's horn, Moses, which was the age of Jews. Before that, you had Taurus, the age of the golden calf, and the initial age of humanity. Before that, you had Gemini, the twins, which represents Esau and Jacob. In Aquarius, the two twins, one of the twins is killed off and becomes Aquarius, the sole surviving male, who is Jacob, who pours out the waters of chaos. This became, in dispensationalism, the age of the Jews, the age of the Gentiles, and ultimately, again, it will become the age of the Jews again in the final era of dispensationalism. The Talmud and Kabbalah are very clear that there are 6,000 years of the present world. The present world has to be completely destroyed. The Kelipot have to be cleansed from the world, meaning the Gentiles have to be exterminated. And then the world to come will arrive when the earthly throne meets the heavenly throne. The earthly Torah is discarded, Yahweh is killed, and the Kabbalists themselves become the gods of the universe.
Well, let me ask you, Mr. Bjerknes, you make it sound like it's futile, and this is just kind of a drama that's undergoing various different stages.
I don't make it sound like
well, I'm not saying you in particular.
Everything I'm doing is trying to inspire people to fight this. And,
well, if I may
it's
finish,
difficult because I don't want to alienate Jews themselves, because Jews themselves could become one of the major forces in trying to prevent this. Although I am a little lost a lot of hope.
Well, let me further elaborate what I meant by that. What I meant by that is that, let's say, combating this is inversion of these Kabbalistic principles, which in regards would be kind of the left-hand path, and it would be the Qliphothe tree of terms of that. Wouldn't that be a combat against against what is playing out now? Couldn't you utilize that?
That is stepping right into their trap. That's what they did with Nazism and with Christianity itself. They view Gentiles as being satanic, so they want to herd Gentile, which is one of the things that I would warn people about with Thomas Carlson's book, is don't read it to learn from it and enter into that sphere, because that is self-destruction of your soul. That is reducing yourself on the left-hand path to nullification, where your soul is divided by Satan into matter and ultimately into nothingness.
So you're talking.
We should not use their playbook against them necessarily. What we should do is formulate our own intelligent response on how we should survive as people and preserve ourselves. And one of the ways of doing that is to see how these mythologies, which have been imposed on people, are self-destructive and are part of a plan to ultimately fulfill the plan of Judaism, which is the demise of the Gentile world. So we shouldn't allow them to frame our thoughts, which, if I understood you correctly, is what you're suggesting, that we should follow this left-hand path.
Not necessarily. I'm just wondering if inversion would be a way to combat their subversion.
Inversion is what they want, because inversion produces our destruction in the name of fighting them.
Okay.
And it does that by inspiring us to wage war against one another that they direct, and in which they have intelligence. They completely have access to all the intelligence of the military of the United States and the military of Red China and the military of Russia. So whatever outcome will happen, they have foreknowledge of. So you can't defeat them in that way. You have to get them out of those institutions so that they no longer have the ability to anticipate everything that we do, think, and say to one another. They're able to monitor all of our communications. They will know exactly what the response is to this video, what people say about this video to one another, what this video inspires people to do in the future. And it's very difficult for us to fight against that. So we have to eliminate their ability to gain that kind of inside knowledge as to what everyone on earth is thinking, doing, and planning.
You mentioned the possibility of disillusioned Jews being a
or
force
enlightened
against...
Jews, I think, would be a better way of putting it.
Right. So, yeah, you point out in your book how Jews never spoke out against the Young Turks or the Bolsheviks, and they turned a blind eye. Here's a quote from page 52.
Not only that, but they were begged to do it. In the London Times, they were begged over and over again, please stop this horrendous genocide. It will produce your own genocide.
But I think this is a brilliant quote from page 52. When crypto-Jewish Bolsheviks committed their atrocities in Russia, many well-meaning persons around the world called upon the Jews of the Western world to denounce these Jewish atrocities against Christians. The same thing had happened when Jews and crypto-Jews committed genocide against Christians in the garb of the Young Turks. In both instances, the warning for Western Jews to denounce the murderous campaigns of Eastern Jews not only went largely unheeded, but Jewish leaders instead attempted to deceive the general public and ridiculed those who were trying to protect all Jews from a backlash against the atrocities of the Young Turks and Bolsheviks by exposing the facts in an effort to bring the mass slaughter to a prompt halt, which would have served the best interests of all humanity, including Jewry. Well-intentioned people suspected that there would be a backlash against all Jews should Jews in general fail to condemn the actions of their co-religionists in the Turkish Empire. As would happen with the Bolshevik Revolution, leading Jews failed to heed this warning and instead stepped forward and shamelessly tried to mislead the public and denied what their fellow Jews had done and were planning to do. Jewry had always had a bad reputation for producing such types, and in abundance. Had Jewish leaders heeded these cries for help, the lives of 1.5 million Armenian Christians and tens of millions of Eastern European Christians would have been spared from the crypto-Jewish mass murderers who later slew them.
Yeah, I couldn't have said it better myself.
Yeah, it's a quote from page 52. So, yeah, that's... so personally, I'm pessimistic about Jews.
Hitler said that his motivation for persecuting European Jewry was what the Bolsheviks had done to Eastern Europeans.
Right.
And they were warned that that would be the response. And their reaction to that warning was disingenuous denials and the perpetuation of mass murder.
Yeah, so regarding the Third Reich, you've written extensively about that, and in particular, the role that the Nazis played in securing Palestine for the Jews. For example, the Ha'avaha transfer agreement, and the Holocaust propaganda. And this was a 2,000-year-old Jewish prophecy fulfilled to a T. Now, there's a new revisionist school of thought that I subscribe to, that the main point of World War II was to kill non-Jews. And this is another Jewish prophecy, of course, which is, like we've discussed, is planned in the Tanakh. And there are new researchers, like, for example, somebody who goes by the moniker Hexan 527. And he looks at how, well, he thinks that the Second World War was orchestrated by Jews. They controlled all sides, and that they deliberately sabotaged battles to maximize deaths of Goyim. So he looks at, for example, Stalingrad and D-Day, and how the war was prolonged. Like, for example, how the Germany declared war against the USA.
And Dunkirk.
Yeah, exactly. So what are your thoughts on that?
They are not mutually exclusive. I think they're part and parcel of the same process.
Yeah.
The creation of Palestine was contingent upon Jews being persecuted in Europe. After the Balfour Declaration, Jews did not want to go to Palestine, so they needed to force them there. They also needed to free them up from the Pale of Settlement, which was achieved by World War I and the Marxist overthrow of the Russian Empire. The Russian Empire then wanted to expand. The Poles fought very valiantly and stopped Trotsky in his expansion westward. Then the Poles suffered terribly from both the Nazis and the Soviets, who divided the nation. They were allies, the Nazis and the communists, in dividing Poland. They then instigated a war, which Stalin knew, Operation Barbarossa. He knew the day it would commence. He did nothing to prepare for it on purpose, so that the Nazis could roll over all of Eastern Europe, create a vast theater of war. They Edvard Beneš in Czechoslovakia was stating in the late 1930s that this would happen and that Hitler would lose the war, and then Stalin would take over all of Eastern Europe and become a neighbor to Czechoslovakia. He actually took over Czechoslovakia. This was all clearly planned. There was the massive slaughter of World War II. The Poles and the Russians, tens of millions were killed. And then when Stalin took over, he killed probably 10 million Germanic people throughout all of Eastern Europe. So it was a massive bloodbath, of course, yes.
Well, my favorite book that you've written, Christopher, is Adolf Hitler, Bolshevik and Zionist, Volume 1, Communism. That's my favorite book that you've written. And you exposed how, for example, Hitler was a communist spy, how he worked for communists in the 1920s.
In the 19-teens, he worked directly for communists right as after Germany lost the war, and he got into Munich and Bavaria. He worked directly for Kurt Eisner, who overthrew the Bavarian monarchy. He worked directly for Eugen Leviné, who was a Leninist who headed the Bavarian Soviet Republic that was inherited after Eisner's assassination through Ernst Toller and communist Jews. And according to Douglas Reed, he was told by Otto Strasser that when Hitler was picked up, he was in the company of Eugen Leviné's bodyguard. He was working as a propagandist on the soldier councils.
Yeah.
He was recruited by Captain Karl Mayer because he was a communist spy to round up communists and infiltrate. He was given educational courses on how to talk like an anti-Semite. And then when he gave his speeches, the Reichswehr, the German army would put in soldiers who would applaud him and give people free beer and sausages to promote him. It was all set up. There was nothing organic about it.
Karl Mayer wrote an article titled "I Was Hitler's Boss." You know,
yes,
which you
And in it,
referenced.
he
And this was
reveals all
known
of
at the
the,
time. This was something that was known at the time that people were calling out, that Hitler was a stooge.
yes, and he mentioned partially some of that in Mein Kampf. He talked about the fact that he was recruited and given lessons and listened to Gottfried Feder, who was part of this instruction course that was organized by Captain Karl Mayer. And it was General Erich Ludendorff, who Hitler himself said was a Freemason, who set all of this up. Erich Ludendorff also arranged for Lenin to travel back to Russia to take over the Russian Revolution and make it the Bolshevik Revolution, to take over from Kerensky. Kerensky's father had been Lenin's teacher. The Kerenskys were also Freemasons. Lenin and Trotsky were also Freemasons. Ludendorff supplied them with train passage through Germany and I think 40 million gold marks. The famous Jewish philosopher Ludwig Wittgenstein supplied the Nazis with 1.7 tons of gold and various other monumental assets to fund the Nazis. They were funded by the Warbirds, by Wall Street and by the Warbirds. And IBM was involved in it, and
IG
Farben was involved in it.
Yeah.
And he was called out for it. And there was Ernst Ahrensperger wrote an article, Adolf Hitler, the Traitor. And he exposed the fact that Hitler was working for Jewish interests and would derail the German Workers' Party of Anton Drexler and make it serve the interests of Jewry and ultimately destroy Germany. And that's exactly what happened. And that was put out, I think, in 1920 or 1921.
Well, basically, communism had failed to take a foothold in Germany, so Nazism was the solution to that.
Right, and the Nazis and communists worked together, and they would engage in street battles in order to set it up so that the government would fall apart, and they would work together to create strikes so that the government would fall apart and the German people would suffer so much that they would allow the Nazis to take over as the supposed saviors from the communism that was destroying Germany. And the communists said that they didn't care how many communists Hitler would kill because Hitler would ultimately serve their interests as he did by expanding the Soviet Union across right up into Germany itself.
Right.
And he was a communist, as you said. He was a dyed-in-the-wool communist who fought for the Bavarian Republic. And another thing that Otto Strasser talked about was the fact that Hitler did not join the Freikorps and never discussed what he did when the Freikorps unseated the Bavarian Soviet Republic, and never mentioned in Mein Kampf what he did for that entire period, because he was working for the communists. He was not fighting against them. And I don't know whether I believe it or not, but I'll mention it as an aside. There was a Rabbi Marvin Antelman who excommunicated Henry Kissinger as a Jew, who wrote a book, Eliminate the Opiate. And he claimed that Hitler was bred in a Shabbatayan ritual to become the Messiah, son of Joseph, which role he played to a T, misleading the Gentiles into their own self-destruction. And that, again, would relate to the Armenian Holocaust. I don't know what facts he had to come to that conclusion, but he was certainly not a stupid man.
I think you're yet to publish your final volume about Hitler and World War II. Is that right? World War II.
I have a couple other volumes. That series may go on for as long as I live, but I'm working on a book on the occult, and I'm working on a book on the Holocaust. And I want to put the occult book out first. I'm glad I've postponed it because I've learned so much more about Kabbalah and how it relates to Messiah, son of Joseph, and Armilus, and the wars between the Messiahs. But I don't know when I'll get to finishing that up. I have so many projects in the work. so many irons in the fire, it's hard to get them off, and I'm not receiving the support that I need to get all this accomplished. So I have to work under terrible duress and stress, and it makes it more difficult. But I'm knocking them off as best I can.
You claim in your book that quote, communism ultimately took some 150 lives or more, and your
Million
sources,
lives.
yeah, and your sources, the Black Book of Communism. How confident are you that figure is accurate?
I think it's actually much higher.
Really?
Yes. I think that book was well researched. I think it contains articles from several prominent sources. I have not seen people disputing it and succeeding. But I think the number is much
the
higher.
official death tolls are much,
Just
much
the Great
lower.
Leap Forward of Mao Zedong, that had to wipe out at least 75 million Chinese. And that was all based on what Joseph did to the Egyptians, the deliberate starvation and destruction of agriculture.
Wow.
Yeah, we're in real danger. I hope people appreciate it, and I certainly don't think the situation is hopeless. We're fighting against a crew of a couple thousand people at the very top. Certainly, if we utilize our intellect and our people together, we can win this battle, but we have to do it now before our ability to communicate is taken away from us. We have to take it seriously, and we have to love ourselves and love our children. And that's one of the things I fear about Christians, is I see so many Christians with this fatalistic Christian attitude cheering this on and hoping for Armageddon. It's so asinine.
Yeah, that's the rapture. That's the rapture element. The
The
millenarian,
the worst of it, yes.
the seeds of millenarian Christianity, which was inherited from Calvinist, and some of the founders of this country laid the seeds for that, for the fatalistic, predeterministic Christianity that you see.
And it all got codified by Schofield and Darby and the dispensationalists and put into the Bible itself in the form of reference notes. And Zionism also got incorporated into it, and the idea that Russia is Gog and Magog and that we have to fight a war against them. They're really good at getting their plans done, and we have to defend ourselves from it, or we're going to be exterminated. Our genetics are being destroyed. Our children's genetics are being destroyed. We have to respond to that.
One thing interesting you mentioned previously that I caught, you were talking about the whole blood of the serpent. You were talking about the serpent seed doctrine. This is something we often see in stuff like, speaking of millenarian apocalyptic Christianity, Christian identity, which was known previously as British Israelism.
The dual seed line theory.
What do you think? What do you think about that in terms of why it gained so much prominence? Let's just say in marginal Christian identity circles, and also was promoted, let's say, by British Israelist. And do you think there is like a mode and purpose and all that?
Yes,
for that being
absolutely.
promoted.
Again, in Kabbalah, there is this conception of the Sitra Achra, which is the other side. It's also called the Sitra de Smola, which means the left-hand side. That is the Gentile universe, which in the Jewish conception is a negative mirror image of the Jewish universe, which is the Sitra Yemina, meaning the right-hand side, also called the Sitra de Kadosha, meaning the holy side. So that everything Jewish has to be mirrored by something Gentile. The reality is that they copied all of their theology from the Christian Orphics and mystery religions and Platonism. But in their conception, Gentiles have to be taught Judaism in a mirror image. And that mirror image has to be exactly what Judaism is, turned on its head. Hence, we have the Gnostics calling Yahweh the evil God and calling Satan the good God.
Yeah.
Yes. Same thing happens with Christian identity. The Gentiles are taught to become Jews and to believe that they are the Jews. This is the same process of Christianity, of convincing Europeans that they are not Europeans, they are Jews, and they abandon all of their own traditions and start to worship the ancestors of the Jews as if they were their own ancestors, while rejecting their own traditions.
This happened in Islam too, by the way, where all the people that were pre-Islamic associated themselves with Muhammad. So it's kind of
Absolutely,
interesting.
yes. And it also happened with Marxism in terms of abandoning capitalism and all of the heritage of the economic systems of European ancestors. So I think that is why Christian identity was set up. It was set up to create the beliefs of the Sitra Achra, of the other side, to convince them that they are the Jews. This creates the ideal mirror image of the Jews, which they then control completely the belief system of. And in their minds, in that process, when the Gentiles do that, when they abandon all of the supernatural protection of their ancestral gods, when they reject the reality of all their ancestors, they are nullified. They cease to exist. And they can therefore be swept away like a broom sweeping away dust on the floor, because they have been reduced on the great chain of being to the level of chaos, of matter, of the material world instead of the spiritual world. And they have been destroyed and nullified. So it is the process of nullification, of severing European human beings from their heritage, from their gods, and from their ancestors, misleading them to believe that they are the Jews themselves, which causes them to cease to exist, to be annihilated and nullified.
There's just so many things I could ask you, and I'm going to ask you this one last question, and I thank you for coming on, Mr. Bjerknes, and hopefully
Thank you so much for having me. This has been a wonderful discussion. You're both intellectuals and very well informed.
And hopefully you'll come on again and discuss with some of your other concepts, maybe getting more of the metaphysics next time, because this is extremely interesting. Now, let me ask you: you're acquainted? I'm pretty sure we've talked about Neoplatonism, Gnosticism, and Hermeticism, and even we haven't discussed Rosicrucianism. But I'm curious, what are like kind of the centralized themes and all of those kind of, we could say, variations of like mystery traditions of the ancient past, which share what is the commonality in all those, and what are the common threads which give way to let's say Jewish influence? And do you think like previously that they were usurped, or do you think they were part of an indigenous European expression that was trying to come through, against Christianity? What's your opinion on that?
I think they're not necessarily European.
Okay.
What you have is this concept of monism that Parmenides picked up on to create the Greek word, the monad, the one, which becomes in the Shema, the prayer of the Jews, the Holy One. And that is the conception that initially there was no division. It was all God in a pantheistic, monadistic system where there was absolute unity. Human beings perceive that there is not such a reality in our world. So they perceive this as distance from that ideal unity, which represented absolute perfect intellect, absolute perfect love, and absolute perfect goodness. And that can only be achieved through non-division, because when you divide from ideal good, you arrive at something other than ideal good. So to differentiate, to divide the one, creates distance from perfection, and creates time, temporalness, and space, as opposed to the one which is ineffable in all of its attributes. You then enter into a dualistic world where the one is partitioned. And the way that they envision that partition of the one is to view the one as an androgyne, as male and female. The God Yahweh is the male aspect of the Godhead, and he has the female aspect, Shekinah. The God Satan has the male aspect, Samael, and the female aspect, Lilith. And then this was brought to humanity, who was created in the image of the one as an androgyne, as Adam, who was then divided into male and female. In the human conception, all of this related to the cycle of day and night, that the universe was divided into a world of dark light and a world of daylight, and that these two cyclical forces represented the polarity of the monad being divided into the dualism of darkness and light, of ideal form in the sense of the conceptions of the one as opposed to the corrupted forms of the world, which are shadows of that ideal form. And that really got set forward by Plato. The idea that when you start to divide God and you start to drop things down from that universal oneness into division, that you then end up with evil that ultimately produces the material world of the earth. The earth is the most fallen of all the worlds and the most distant from God. And then you have this Platonic notion of the soul as being part of the body, trapped in this material world, and that it can be elevated through knowledge and self-contemplation back to the one and have a unio mystica, an ecstatic reunion with the one. And that is the essential common theme of all these religions, that it is incumbent upon the human being to free his soul, his mind from the material world so that it can reunite with the one of the monad. And then you have in the more Egyptian and Sumerian conceptions, this idea of the eagle and the serpent on the tree. The eagle is at the apex of the tree and the crown of the tree and can fly and return to the gods and become one with the gods. The serpent is in the material world of the earth. And then the human being has a decision to make. The human being can decide to become the eagle and to fly back to the gods and reunite and become one with the one and lose the ego. They call it the death of the ego. This is the path of the right-hand side up the Sephirotic tree, back to a mystical reunion with the one and the loss of dualism and the loss of self. The other path is to follow the serpent into the earth, into the realm of chaos, and to undergo division from God to the greatest extent so that one can become one's own God and ultimately, in a form, kill off the one and supplant the one. And this is the path of the Shabbatayan Kabbalists, which they also teach to the Gentiles as the right-hand path of Satanism. But what happens to Gentiles is that when they enter this realm, they are nullified. Satan, the great divider, divides them infinitely to the point of nothingness, where they surrender their soul and give it to the Jews.
I think Aleister Crowley called this Karanzon.
Might well be. I'm not familiar with that. But the Kabbalists believe that they can then absorb all of the holy light as well as the dark light and become their own monad, as their own completely separated from the one to become their own one. And I think that's the common theme, that the human being is confronted with an evil inclination. Plato had the idea of the charioteer with a black horse and a white horse pulling the soul in one direction or the other. The Sumerians had the idea adopted by the Gnostics of the eagle and the serpent. And the Kabbalists have the idea of the Yetzer Hara, the evil inclination, and the good inclination, driving the soul in these two different directions. And that ultimately it is the evil that wins and can unite everything in one force.
Interesting.
Yeah.
Chris, do you have anything else to discuss with Mr. Bjerknes before we go off?
One last question for Mr. Bjerknes. What's your favorite book that you've written?
I would say Beware the World to Come, I think, was my most impactful and favorite book, and most unique, I think.
Yeah. It's a fantastic book.
Thank you.
Do you have any closing remarks, Mr. Bjerknes? And by
I
the way,
just want to thank you, gentlemen, for this wonderful.
Coming on, by the way.
Thank you for having me. This has been a wonderful discussion. I hope we can do it again soon.
Absolutely. And with nothing else to say, I want to thank you guys for tuning in to the Killing Fields. I hope this engagement has been insightful. I hope this has been kind of out of the ordinary and different from what we usually do around here. But I hope a lot of people have gleaned from this conversation and discussion, metaphysical, historical, and very real analysis of like the metaphysical underpinnings of Judaic, the Judaic kind of crisis that is asserting itself onto the world. So thank you very much, guys, for tuning in. And with that
Thank
said,
you.
see you,
Thank
Cal.
you.